Deep within the high desert basin of northeastern Utah lies a 512-acre parcel of land that has quietly dismantled our understanding of modern physics, Skinwalker Ranch. For decades, it has been called the most scientifically investigated paranormal hotspot on the face of the Earth. We have heard the accounts of unidentified aerial craft hovering without propulsion, magnetic anomalies warping localized space, and bizarre biological trauma inflicted on those who dare to investigate its soil. But for all the eyes turned toward the sky above the Uinta Basin, the true key to this ancient mystery was never floating in the clouds. It was resting in absolute darkness, sealed beneath hundreds of feet of solid, unbroken stone. Recently, a team of elite geophysicists, field engineers, and researchers deployed an array of subterranean imaging technologies across the property's most notorious zone, the Triangle. What they were searching for was a simple geological baseline, a standard mapping of natural subterranean aquifers, bedrock density, and fault lines. What they found instead was a geometric impossibility. Drawn clearly on their seismic and ground-penetrating radar displays was a massive, perfectly carved subterranean conduit, a tunnel extending deep into the earth, lined with density signatures that do not exist in nature. It doesn't match the chaotic winding path of a natural lava tube. It defies the erosion patterns of ancient underground riverbeds. It is a straight, deliberate, hyper-engineered passage that appears to lead directly beneath the ranch's most active anomaly zones, shielded by an impenetrable shell that actively deflects high-frequency radar waves. A tunnel beneath Skinwalker Ranch that, by every law of known geology, simply shouldn't exist. To understand why this discovery sent immediate shockwaves through the scientific team, you have to understand the geology of the Uinta Basin. This region is a structural basin filled with layers of sedimentary rock, sandstone, shale, and siltstone deposited over tens of millions of years. It is not a volcanic landscape. There are no ancient basaltic flows here to create natural lava tubes. The surrounding bedrock is dense, friable, and prone to severe structural collapse under immense pressure. Constructing a stable hollow cavity of this scale, dozens of feet beneath the surface without modern steel reinforcements and heavy industrial boring machines, is an engineering feat that should be impossible. Yet the data streams refusing to lie showed a vacant, structurally sound void cutting directly through the solid strata. When the team first processed the raw seismic reflection data, the immediate reaction in the command center was skepticism. Equipment failure is the default assumption at Skinwalker Ranch. The property is infamous for destroying hard drives, draining lithium batteries in minutes, and frying sensitive circuit boards. The team recalibrated their sensors, deployed secondary electrical resistivity arrays, and ran the scans again. The result was identical. The void was real. It possessed a uniform width, smooth lateral boundaries, and a continuous decline that plunged deeper into the earth as it traveled toward the Mesa cliff face. Even more unsettling was what the electrical resistivity readings revealed about the tunnel's outer walls. Standard sedimentary rock conducts electricity in a predictable, uniform manner based on moisture and mineral content, but the perimeter of this subterranean passage exhibited near-zero electrical conductivity. It was as if the tunnel wasn't merely dug out of the rock but fused, vitrified, or lined with an exotic, highly insulating material that isolated the interior of the passage from the surrounding earth. As word of the subterranean structure spread among the researchers, long-buried historical accounts began to take on a terrifying new context. Decades earlier, when indigenous tribes traversed this basin, oral traditions warned of entities that did not arrive from the stars, but emerged directly from the belly of the earth through hidden stone doorways. When civilian owners occupied the ranch in the late 20th century, they reported hearing distinct, heavy mechanical thuds echoing from deep underground during the quietest hours of the night, vibrations that shook the floorboards of the homesteads without triggering local earthquake monitors. For years, those stories were dismissed as psychological stress or ambient environmental noise. But now, with a three-dimensional volumetric map of a synthetic tunnel sitting on their monitors, the scientists realized they were no longer dealing with folklore. They were staring at the physical infrastructure of an underground network, and as they prepared to drill their first exploratory core hole to reach the void, the mountain above them began to respond. The decision to drill an exploratory core hole directly into the ceiling of the newly mapped subterranean void was met with immediate resistance from the field crew. At Skinwalker Ranch, every veteran investigator knows a fundamental rule. The moment you disturb the earth, the property reacts. Drilling into the mesa or piercing the soil of the triangle had historically triggered acute electromagnetic spikes, catastrophic equipment failures, and severe physiological distress among personnel. But for a team driven by empirical science, a clear radar anomaly buried beneath hundreds of feet of stone could not simply be left unexamined. The scientific team brought in a heavy-duty, track-mounted core drilling rig capable of penetrating dense sedimentary rock down to 300 feet. The target coordinate was precisely calculated using real-time RTK GPS systems, positioning the diamond-tipped drill bit directly over the central spine of the subterranean conduit. The plan was straightforward: bore a 4-inch vertical shaft straight down into the roof of the void, drop a hardened multispectral inspection camera into the darkness, and finally see what was hiding inside the hollow space. As the industrial diesel engine roared to life, the diamond bit began its slow, grueling bite into the topsoil of the triangle. For the first 20 feet, the telemetry sensors on the drilling rig reported standard operation. Torque, hydraulic pressure, and vibration profiles matched the expected resistance of soft shale and weathered sandstone. The drill slurry flowing up the shaft brought up normal gray sludge and crushed quartz sediment. Then, at precisely 37 feet down, everything changed. Without warning, the drill string dropped 4 inches in a fraction of a second, as if it had breached a thin void, before grinding to a catastrophic halt. The diesel engine groaned under immense strain, and hydraulic pressure gauges spiked straight into the red danger zone. The heavy steel drill pipe began to whip violently in its tower, vibrating at a frequency so severe that it sheared the mounting bolts off the primary stabilizer assembly. The lead driller instantly cut the power to prevent the steel string from snapping deep inside the hole. When the crew pulled the drill string back up to the surface to inspect the bit, what they found left them speechless. The industrial-grade diamond bit, engineered to grind through solid granite and reinforced concrete, was completely destroyed. The diamond matrix had been sheared flat, and the heavy tungsten carbide teeth were blunted, crushed, and discolored by an intense localized heat flash. Yet, the temperature sensors inside the drill shaft registered an ambient reading of just 45 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no geothermal heat source in the shaft. The bit had not melted from friction. It had struck something so incredibly hard and thermal resistant that the rotational force of the machine had pulverized the industrial metal in a matter of seconds. The spoils pile washed out of the drill hole contained tiny metallic flakes that glinted brightly under the desert sun. The research team immediately collected the material and placed it under a portable scanning electron microscope inside the mobile command trailer. The elemental analysis was staggering. The flakes were not natural mineral inclusions or drill bit debris. They were composed of a highly refined engineered alloy dominated by titanium, aluminum, and iron, structured in a microcrystalline lattice that exhibited extraordinary thermal resistance and structural density. Embedded within this metallic matrix were microscopic layers of carbonaceous material that absorbed the electron microscope's beam, preventing standard elemental identification. The drill hadn't just struck a hard rock stratum. It had slammed into the upper structural shell of the tunnel itself, a multi-layered composite barrier designed to withstand unimaginable structural loads and thermal stress. As the team processed the microscopic analysis, the ambient environment around the drilling rig began to destabilize. The multi-channel spectrum analyzers monitoring radio frequencies as across the property recorded an instantaneous surge centered on the 1.6 GHz band. But unlike previous broad-spectrum interference, this transmission was emanating directly out of the narrow, 4-inch borehole. It was a directional, tightly focused radio frequency beam, firing straight up into the open sky like an invisible electromagnetic exhaust pipe. The team lowered a high-frequency directional antenna directly over the mouth of the drill hole. The audio output from the spectrum analyzer filled the trailer with a rhythmic pulsing signal, a precise, digital cadence repeating every 1.6 seconds. The tunnel beneath Skinwalker Ranch wasn't just a physical hollow space in the rock. It was pressurized, shielded, and actively broadcasting an artificial signal from the dark depths of the earth. The realization that a 4-inch exploratory shaft had essentially turned into a vertical waveguide, broadcasting a 1.6 GHz signal directly out of the earth, forced the team to alter their strategy. Physical drilling had hit an impenetrable composite barrier, destroying industrial-grade tungsten carbide in seconds and unleashing an active electromagnetic beam. If they couldn't cut through the roof of the passage with mechanical force, they had to inspect the interior without touching the physical structure again. They prepared a specialized ultra-slim sensor assembly designed to be lowered directly down the open borehole to the exact point of impact at 37 feet. The package contained a miniaturized fiber optic camera with a sapphire glass lens, an acoustic resonance transceiver, and a high-precision magnetometer capable of detecting minuscule shifts in localized microtesla magnetic fields. The crew stood in total silence as the fiber optic line was fed manually down into the dark vertical hole. On the primary monitors inside the command trailer, the high-definition video feed showed the smooth, spiral-grooved walls of sandstone carved out by the initial phase of drilling. At 35 feet down, the light from the camera's LED array illuminated the bottom of the shaft. There, resting directly at the base of the borehole, was the dark vitrified layer that had destroyed the drill bit. It was not gray sandstone or dark shale. It was a smooth, obsidian-like surface that looked like melted glass, showing no fractures, stress cracks, or physical indentations despite being struck by tons of rotational drilling force. The camera dropped the final 2 feet until the sapphire lens rested less than an inch above the mysterious shell. Suddenly, the acoustic resonance transceiver sent a low-amplitude sonic pulse straight into the surface to measure the thickness of the material based on sound wave reflections. The moment the acoustic wave struck the vitrified shell, the visual display on the control monitors glitched violently. Horizontal bands of green and blue digital noise swept across the screen, and the audio monitor emitted a high-pitched feedback squeal that forced the technicians to throw off their headsets. When the camera feed stabilized 3 seconds later, the dark obsidian floor of the borehole was gone. The sapphire lens was no longer looking at a solid metallic shell. It was looking down into a vast unlit cavernous expanse. The composite barrier had not breached physically. Rather, the material itself had momentarily altered its density or optical opacity in direct response to the acoustic pulse, revealing the open interior of the subterranean conduit below. Through the camera's wide-angle lens, the internal geometry of the tunnel came into sharp, terrifying focus. The passage was completely hollow, extending horizontally in both directions beyond the reach of the camera's illumination array. The floor, ceiling, and lateral walls were perfectly curved, forming a flawless cylindrical conduit approximately 20 feet in diameter. The interior surfaces were covered in a metallic ribbed lattice, a series of raised, interlocking structural rings that ran down the length of the passage like the ribcage of a colossal machine. There was no dust, no fallen rock debris, and no evidence of groundwater leakage despite the tunnel cutting directly through subterranean aquifers. The air inside the passage was completely static, clear, and dry. Then, the magnetometer stream locked onto the display screens inside the trailer. The magnetic sensor lowered into the void was recording a continuous, powerful magnetic gradient running along the horizontal length of the tunnel. It was not a static magnetic field like that of iron ore or natural lodestone. The field was moving. A concentrated magnetic vector was flowing down the length of the tunnel from the direction of the Mesa toward the triangle area at a speed of precisely 42 meters per second. The subterranean tunnel was not built as a shelter, a bunker, or a storage facility. It was an active linear accelerator, a subterranean energy conduit designed to transport massive electromagnetic charges beneath the floor of the valley, without exposing them to the atmosphere above. Before the team could rotate the optical camera to capture the direction of the magnetic flow, the temperature sensors inside the drill shaft dropped precipitously. Within 4 seconds, the ambient temperature at the bottom of the borehole plummeted from 45 degrees Fahrenheit to negative 14 degrees. Thick frost began forming on the fiber optic cable at the surface, creeping up out of the drill hole like a living white frostbite. A split second later, the magnetometer reading overloaded, hitting maximum capacity, and the fiber optic camera feed went pitch black as the sapphire lens froze instantly and shattered under catastrophic thermal collapse. The sudden, violent thermal collapse inside the borehole sent a cold wave of realization through the scientific team. A drop to negative 14 degrees Fahrenheit inside a dry 37-foot shaft defied every principle of localized thermodynamics. Under standard physics, freezing air requires a massive transfer of energy. Whatever was flowing through that subterranean conduit had just absorbed every joule of thermal energy in its immediate surroundings, converting the borehole into a cryogenic vacuum to protect its internal environment. When the engineering crew pulled the severed fiber optic line out of the ground, the lower 3 feet of the high-strength cable were encased in a solid sheath of milky white ice. The sapphire lens of the camera assembly was shattered into thousands of microscopic fractures, pulverized by the instantaneous thermal contraction. The team was no longer just observing a static geological curiosity. They had established a direct physical link into a powered, reactive subterranean transit system running directly beneath their feet. To determine the full spatial trajectory of this underground conduit without risking more equipment down the borehole, Dr. Travis Taylor and lead systems engineer Erik Bard deployed an ultra-sensitive microgravimeter array across the property. Microgravimetry measures minuscule variations in the Earth's gravitational field caused by changes in subterranean density. Solid rock creates a slightly stronger localized gravitational pull, while a hollow cavern, tunnel, or void creates a distinct gravitational deficit. For 16 continuous hours, the crew moved across the desert floor in a precise grid pattern, taking hundreds of gravimetric measurements from the base of the Mesa all the way to the western perimeter fence. When the supercomputing array finished compiling the gravimetric data points into a 3-dimensional topographic model, the full scale of the underground infrastructure was exposed. The 20-foot-wide cylindrical tunnel was not an isolated feature. It was the primary artery of a vast interconnected subterranean network. The gravimetric scan showed the main conduit originating deep within the core of the Mesa cliff face, resting nearly 200 feet beneath the stone, before running in a flawless, straight line beneath the triangle. But as it reached the central floor of the valley, the main shaft split into 3 secondary distribution tunnels that branched off at precise 60-degree angles, forming a massive geometric trident embedded in the bedrock. Every single branch of this subterranean network terminated directly beneath known high anomaly zones on the ranch: the East Field, the Homestead 2 ruin, and the Northern Ridge. The ground above Skinwalker Ranch wasn't just a random patch of land experiencing strange phenomena. It was a carefully mapped surface grid sitting directly on top of an underground power distribution matrix. The strange aerial sightings, the localized radiation bursts, and the GPS glitches were not originating in the sky. They were the atmospheric exhaust of a system operating deep below the Earth. As the team stared at the volumetric map rendering on their screens, a secondary sensor array picked up a dramatic change in soil resistivity along the path of the secondary tunnels. Deep underground, the high-purity metallic alloy lining the walls of the conduit was beginning to charge. Millions of watts of electrical current were migrating through the vitrified shell of the tunnel system, utilizing the surrounding wet sandstone aquifers as a grounded return circuit. Out on the ranch floor, the team's field vehicles began to experience spontaneous electrical shorts. Digital dashboards flickered, headlights turned on and off independently, and the main generator supplying power to the command trailer suffered a total voltage collapse, dropping from 240 volts to 0 in a fraction of a millisecond. The crew stepped out of the trailer into the dark desert night to inspect the main breaker box. The air across the valley had taken on a heavy metallic scent, a pungent concentration of pure ozone that made every breath burn. Looking toward the mesa, the researchers saw something that chilled them to the bone. Along the exact line where the microgravimetry scan showed the subterranean tunnel passing beneath the ground, the desert topsoil was glowing with a faint, bioluminescent green phosphorescence. Small electrical arcs were leaping between individual blades of dry grass, tracing the subterranean pathway of the tunnel across the dark field like a glowing fuse burning across the earth. The conduit beneath Skinwalker Ranch was no longer in a standby state. The exploratory core hole had disturbed its equilibrium, and the machine inside the Earth was now actively routing massive amounts of energy toward the surface. The glowing trail of green phosphorescence snaking across the desert floor provided an unmistakable visual roadmap of the subterranean energy surge. What had previously been invisible vector lines on a computer monitor was now a physical crackling arc of light cutting directly through the dark soil of the triangle. The energy moving through the underground conduit was so intense that it was ionization charging the mineral content of the topsoil, forcing the ground itself to bleed light into the night air. Dr. Travis Taylor and the field team scrambled to deploy an array of optical spectrum analyzers and high-frequency magnetometers directly along the path of the glowing line. They needed to measure the field density of the ground before the energy dissipated or triggered a catastrophic discharge into the open atmosphere. As the technicians placed the copper-grounded magnetometer spikes into the glowing dirt, the digital readouts on their handheld meters went into severe overload. The localized magnetic field was pulsing at a rate of precisely 1.6 gigahertz, matching the exact radio transmission that had previously emanated from the exploratory borehole. The subterranean tunnel wasn't just transporting electrical current. It was using the 1.6 gigahertz frequency as a carrier wave to stabilize a massive, coherent electromagnetic plasma stream deep within the Earth. Suddenly, the ground beneath the team's boots began to vibrate with a violent, rhythmic tremor. But this was not a seismic shear wave. The local seismometers, anchored deep into the bedrock, showed near-zero lateral or vertical earth movement. The sensation of shaking was purely electromagnetic, a powerful, low-frequency force field interacting directly with the metallic iron in human blood and the calcium in human bone, creating the acute physical perception of an earthquake without moving a single grain of sand. Several crew members instantly experienced severe physiological distress. Nausea, intense pressure behind the eyes, and a total loss of spatial balance swept through the team. The physiological symptoms matched the exact historical reports documented by military intelligence personnel decades earlier during classified defense operations on the property. The symptoms were not psychological reactions to a scary environment. They were the direct biological consequences of human nervous systems being exposed to a high-density, low-frequency electromagnetic pulse radiating outward from the subterranean conduit. Determined to trace the energy flow to its ultimate destination, the team followed the glowing ground line as it traveled westward toward the steep cliff face of the mesa. As the line reached the sheer sandstone wall, the green phosphorescence didn't stop. It began to climb vertical rock face. The electrical charge crept up the rock like a living network of glowing vines, illuminating the ancient petroglyphs carved into the cliff face centuries ago by indigenous tribes. The light-illuminated spiral shapes, geometric grids, and stylized human figures with elongated heads, the exact patterns carved into the stone by ancient observers. As the cold green plasma filled the deep grooves of the petroglyphs, the stone itself began to emit a resonant glass-like hum that echoed across the quiet valley. The team raised their thermal imaging cameras toward the cliff face. On the multispectral thermal displays, the solid sandstone rock wall of the Mesa appeared to dissolve. Behind the outer rock strata, 30 feet inside the mountain, sat a massive glowing heat signature, a distinct, rectangular structural portal connecting the subterranean tunnel network directly to a massive interior chamber embedded within the mountain. The portal wall inside the mountain was operating at an extreme cold differential, reading at -20 degrees Celsius, while the surrounding stone registered at ambient desert summer heat. The subterranean tunnel was feeding a massive cryogenic cooling loop directly into the heart of the Mesa, maintaining the structural stability of whatever machine was housed within the mountain's core. The scientist realized with terrifying clarity that the tunnel running beneath the triangle was not a localized anomaly. It was an intake manifold, a massive feeder line drawing energy, water, and atmospheric static from across the basin and funneling it into a central subterranean vault buried beneath the rock. Before the team could set up a secondary camera array to record the thermal portal, the high-voltage electrical lines supplying power to the entire ranch complex detonated in a series of bright, blinding flashes. The transformers on the utility poles along the perimeter fence exploded simultaneously, throwing the entire valley into total pitch-black darkness. The only light remaining on the 512-acre property was the cold green glowing line carved into the soil, burning brighter than ever as the machine inside the earth prepared for its final operational phase. With the ranch's primary electrical grid completely destroyed and the valley plunged into absolute darkness, the cold green light emanating from the soil became the sole source of illumination across the entire 512-acre property. The glowing line cutting through the triangle was no longer just crackling along the surface, it was expanding laterally, turning the dry desert soil into an active, glowing ribbon of ionized earth nearly 10 feet wide. Inside the mobile command trailer, emergency battery backup systems kicked in, their low amber warning lights illuminating the tense faces of the scientific crew. Despite the total loss of grid power, the trailer's autonomous, battery-powered spectrum analyzers and field sensors were recording data streams that shattered every theoretical model of localized electromagnetic behavior. The subterranean tunnel running 37 feet beneath their feet was now acting as a colossal subterranean inductive coil. Dr. Travis Taylor and Chief Engineer Erik Bard monitored the real-time telemetry from the microgravimeter array. The gravity deficit readings along the path of the tunnel were fluctuating in a rhythmic sinusoidal pattern. Every 1.6 seconds, the localized gravitational pull directly over the subterranean passage would drop by nearly 3% before snapping back to baseline, a phenomenon that should require the localized mass of a small mountain to instantly vanish and reappear. The machine inside the Earth was actively manipulating localized spacetime metrics to stabilize the energy stream moving through the conduit. Suddenly, a sharp metallic pop echoed from the direction of the exploratory drill hole. The 4-inch steel casing that had been driven into the ground to secure the borehole was ejected vertically out of the earth like an artillery shell, soaring over 50 feet into the night sky before slamming back down into the dirt. Emerging from the open borehole was no longer a simple radio signal or a blast of frozen air. It was a visible, highly organized column of coherent, pale blue light firing straight up into the low-hanging cloud cover above the ranch. The column of light possessed no thermal signature on the multispectral heat cameras. It was completely cold, reading at absolute zero ambient radiation, yet it was so optically dense that it cast long, hard shadows across the field vehicles parked hundreds of yards away. The team deployed a high-speed, military-grade LiDAR scanner directly toward the light column to analyze its physical composition. The laser pulses sent toward the blue beam did not pass through, scatter, or reflect back to the receiver. Instead, the LiDAR data showed the light beam acting as a solid physical cylinder, a dense structural pillar of structured photons extending from 37 feet beneath the Earth's crust straight into the upper atmosphere. Simultaneously, the 1.6 GHz spectrum monitor recorded a secondary data layer riding on top of the primary carrier wave. The audio translation of the frequency filled the command trailer with a complex mathematical sequence of tonal harmonics. It was not static. It was a high-density, multi-channel telemetry burst, an automated diagnostic sequence being transmitted from the subterranean tunnel out into the upper atmosphere, relaying operational status parameters to an unknown receiver in low Earth orbit or deep space. Out in the triangle, the ground vibration shifted from a low hum into a sharp, crystalline pitch that caused the glass windows of the field vehicles to spiderweb with stress fractures. The three secondary distribution tunnels that branched off from the main conduit beneath the valley floor began to activate in sequence. On the gravimetric display, the trident-shaped subterranean network lit up like a glowing circuit board embedded in the bedrock. Energy was being routed away from the Mesa and pushed simultaneously toward the East Field, Homestead 2, and the Northern Ridge. At each of the three termination points across the ranch, the dry desert topsoil began to bulge upward, lifting heavy sandstone boulders and earth like a localized subterranean bubble expanding beneath the surface. The scientists watched in breathless terror on their thermal imaging monitors as three identical thermal voids materialized at the three ends of the underground trident. The subterranean tunnel network was not just a passive power line or a structural bunker. It was a multinodal deployment platform, a subterranean matrix designed to project high-density, localized physical anomalies to multiple surface coordinates simultaneously. The machine beneath Skinwalker Ranch had reached total operational resonance, and the surface of the property was now completely under its mechanical control. The simultaneous activation of the three subterranean termination points marked the ultimate realization of what lies beneath Skinwalker Ranch. The trident-shaped network carved deep into the sedimentary rock was no longer a dormant relic of an unknown past. It was a fully functional, highly coordinated infrastructure operating with a level of technological mastery that renders modern human engineering primitive by comparison. The anomalies that have baffled investigators, military personnel, and scientists for generations were never random paranormal occurrences. They are the deliberate, calibrated outputs of an underground control system that continues to operate directly beneath our feet. As the energy pulse reached its absolute peak, the column of cold blue light shooting out of the borehole suddenly collapsed inward, contracting into a single, blinding point of white energy directly at the mouth of the shaft. A split second later, a soft, implosive shock wave rippled across the triangle, not with a destructive blast, but with a silent, localized gravitational draw that instantly extinguished the green phosphorescence in the soil and reset the atmospheric pressure across the entire valley to perfect equilibrium. The power grid remained dead. The transformers remained shattered, but the Earth itself grew completely still. The microgravimeters, magnetometers, and thermal arrays slowly returned to baseline readings. The subterranean conduit running 37 feet below had returned to its standby state, sealing its structural vault behind the impenetrable composite layer that had shattered tungsten carbide hours before. But the data recorded during those frantic hours had forever rewritten the history of the property. What the scientific team discovered beneath Skinwalker Ranch is a physical truth that can no longer be denied or dismissed. We now know that a massive hyper-engineered tunnel system cuts through solid sandstone where no natural caves should exist. We know that its walls are lined with exotic, heat-resistant composite alloys that actively insulate its interior from external physics. We know that it utilizes the deep mineral aquifers of the Uinta Basin as a grounded power system, broadcasting a 1.6 GHz carrier wave that interacts directly with localized spacetime, atmospheric pressure, and the human nervous system. The discovery of this subterranean network fundamentally shifts our understanding of the phenomenon. For decades, humanity has looked to the skies, searching the stars for answers to the unidentified craft and strange energy signatures that haunt our planet. But the evidence gathered at Skinwalker Ranch suggests a reality far more profound and immediate. The answer isn't coming from light years away. It is sitting quietly beneath hundreds of feet of solid stone, housed inside an ancient, subterranean intelligence that has been monitoring, managing, and interacting with this planet long before recorded human history began. The tunnel beneath Skinwalker Ranch shouldn't exist according to our textbooks, our geology, or our current understanding of physics. Yet it sits there in the absolute darkness, waiting, powered, and fully operational. As science slowly develops the tools to peer deeper into the dark corners of our world, we are forced to confront a humbling realization. We are not the primary occupants of this planet, nor are we the architects of its greatest secrets. We are merely observers walking on top of a world far grander, older, and stranger than we ever dared to dream. If this deep dive into the groundbreaking discoveries beneath Skinwalker Ranch changed your perspective on the unknown, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing you high-production, in-depth investigative documentaries on the world's greatest mysteries. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. Do you believe this subterranean tunnel is an ancient planetary monitoring station or something far more active? Thank you for watching, and stay curious.